Hello, and thank you for coming to today's session, Using Grade Data to Foster Student Success Inside and Outside the Classroom. I'm Briandy Walden, and I am the Associate Director for Student Academic Services and Student Success Technologies at UC Irvine. And my co-presenter is Vadnais, a Senior User Experience Architect and the Descriptive Analytics Lead for the COMPASS Student Success Initiative. This is the abstract we submitted, and just to give you a frame of reference for what we'll be talking about today in this presentation. So a little bit about our campus. UC Irvine is part of the University of California system, and we're very proud of the many accolades we've received, especially in the last 10 years. And we are located between Los Angeles and San Diego on the coast of California. So a little bit about our Student Success Initiative to give some framing to the types of reports that Ray will be showing you later. The COMPASS Initiative is actually a cross-functional effort on our campus to bring together IT, data analysts, and functional users in order to ensure that we're using data to help our undergraduate population succeed. Basically, what we're doing is taking the data that we have all scattered across campus and bringing it into a place where it can be reported upon and analysis can be done such that we can take actions in order to have interventions and outreach to our undergraduate population towards the goal of having our students graduate in a timely manner. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ray so he can actually show some of the products that we've created for our campus that allow us to get to that goal.
All right, so now let's jump in and talk about grades data here at UCI. We provide two different types of grades data to our end users. There are the final grades assigned by instructors, which are available in individual forms to students. They can see their own grades. Anonymized versions to instructors and academic administrators via some of our reports for COMPASS, as well as advisors via COMPASS for advisors, and then bulk grades data available to advisors via COMPASS for advisors. We also provide assignment scores from the learning management system via a tool called ScoreShare to advisors, and then of course instructors and students can view it through Canvas itself. So again, final grades and assignment scores, and I'll be showing some reports that showcase both of those in just a minute. So who can access grades data? I kind of gave this away a minute ago, but we have three primary audiences I'll be talking about today. Academic administrators, so deans, associate deans, and departmental chairs. They get aggregated program level data. They can see overall GPA, certain course GPA, stuff like that. Academic advisors have access to individualized identified grades data, individualized identified assignment score data through that ScoreShare system that I mentioned, as well as aggregated class level grades data. And instructors get, they can view their own grades, obviously, but then they can also run several reports and view aggregated class level grades data. So academic administrators, advisors, and instructors. And our goal is to be as broad as possible while still respecting student rights, LEI, legitimate educational interest, FERPA, all that. But one thing that is important to note is that instructors can look up class level grades data in an aggregate form for any class at UCI, not just classes that they taught or that are within their specific department, program, or discipline. So how do users access all of this data? There's the registrar systems, which I mentioned a second ago, but then the two that I'll be talking about today are UCI COMPASS, which is a project that I work on. We provide curated reports with a flexible set of filters. It's all powered by the IBM Cognos Business Intelligence tool. The two that I'll be showing today are our grade comparison and grade distribution tools. All of our data comes from the registrar admissions and other systems. The other system that I'll be talking about is ScoreShare, EEE plus ScoreShare. It's part of our LMS system, our LMS environment. It's a custom web application that enables per-student data retrieval through a pretty easy lookup system. The data for that all comes directly from Canvas via the Canvas data product. We have a Redshift instance that instructor maintains on our behalf, and it's available only to advisors. So it's a pretty limited system. I think there's like 80 users who have access to it. And one thing I want to note before we dive into all these samples that we'll be showing letter grades is what's in a letter. So I mean, it seems pretty easy, A, B, C, D, F, whatever other notations we have. But there's a lot more to it than that. So these are just some of the considerations that our Center for Assessment and Applied Research helped us with. These are all listed on our COMPASS website. So before an instructor clicks into any of our grade reports, they have some text that shows them all this, so just so that they can see, I'm about to see these letter grades. What does it really mean? Like, how were those letters arrived at? There's lots of things that could impact letter grades. There's administrative policies. prior preparation on the part of the students, how motivated the students are, how much they attend class, how much time they spend studying. When the class is offered, is an 8 a.m. Monday class versus, like a 2 p.m. Wednesday class? How big is the class? Small one, large one? Who's teaching the course? What are the teaching practices and modalities? How are students being assessed in the class? Is the instructor using absolute or curve grading? So there's just lots of factors that can go into it, and it's really important just to be aware of these before we start diving into reports where you're going to start seeing a whole bunch of letter grades. The first report I'm going to show is the Course Grade Comparison Insights report. It is useful for comparing data across courses. So who can see this report? It's available to instructors and advisors. It provides them with aggregated grades data, and again, it is used to compare performance in Course A versus Course B, where again, we're defining performance to be the letter grade assigned by the instructor at the end of the term, subject to all that stuff that I mentioned before. So users will input 2 courses, and then they'll get an output of a heat map visualizing the assigned grades. Let me make that a little bit bigger for you. So here we have 2 courses. We'll call them Course A and Course B. This is pulling in all of the letter grades assigned to students who completed those courses since fall 2003. Most of our reports go back 5 or 10 years. This one goes back slightly farther, although we are looking at narrowing that a little bit since our university demographics have changed so much since 2003, which is actually when I was an undergraduate. Much different campus these days. So we're looking at kind of tightening that up a bit so it's a little bit better comparing the data, or at least letting users have that flexibility. Maybe they want to look at 20 years of grade data or just 3 years. So anyways, so as we can see, Course A on the left, Course B on the top. These are related classes. Course A is a prerequisite for Course B, so one would expect that a student who did well in Course B probably did well in Course A, which this would seem to indicate. There is some interesting stuff, however. A student, for example, who earned a C in Course A, a lot of those students actually tended to do pretty well, and they'd earn a B in Course A, although very few C students in Course A earned an A in Course B. So that's some of the type of information you can draw out of this. Instructors can hover over any of these intersections and see the raw numbers that go into them. The shading in this case goes from 0 to 1,000 plus students, so being able to hover makes that a little bit more useful. This also helps to identify some of the weird like outsiders or outliers. So for example, on Course A, there's a student who earned an F on Course A, but then they earned an A- in Course B. Typically, that's because there are multiple classes that will satisfy that prerequisite for Course B. So, maybe the student failed Course A and then they took Course X, did well in that, and they did well in Course B. But again, the majority of the grades kind of follow what you would expect. A student who does well in A does well in B and vice versa. We provide 3 other variants of this report. So I showed you variant 1, which was course to course. The other 3 that we provide are course to section, which is how did students in my section perform in the prerequisite course. And then section to course, how did my students perform in the next course in the sequence? And section to section, how did students in my section last quarter perform in the subsequent section this quarter? So we provide, again, instructors can look up any course they want, any section they want. They're not restricted to just their own. So it's helpful for them to be able to see how did their students perform in the previous classes. They can look at the end of the year and compare their various courses with each other. So they can do all sorts of interesting things with these reports. So again, I already mentioned these use cases, but there are several opportunities. They can identify possible performance correlations. Students who did well in Course A tended to do well in Course B, but that will lead to future, questions and things to be answered. Just because a student did well in Course A and Course B doesn't necessarily mean that performance in Course A directly correlates to increased performance in Course B. They can also provide an additional data point when you're looking at the efficacy of prerequisite courses. And it can be used as a self-check for potential teaching effectiveness. So I can see how my students performed in the follow-up classes to the one that I actually taught. And again, you're going to notice this throughout the next couple of things I'm going to show, but the data is useful for discovering new questions to ask. So a letter grade's just a letter grade, but seeing it at this aggregated bulk level really can lead to some interesting patterns emerging and being able to dig into why those patterns actually occur. So the next report I want to show is the Course Grade Distribution Insights report. This lets you compare grades within a course itself. So this is available to instructors and advisors. They have slightly different views. Advisors get a little more detail than instructors. It provides aggregated grades data to these audiences, and it's used to visualize the performance in Course A and then slice it by the demographic criteria, which is a really cool thing, which I'll show in just a sec. So in this case, I inputted a course. I actually input all sections of a particular course. We'll just call it History 1. It's not a history class, just picking that out of thin air. So this is History 1 in fall 2019. 1,100 students completed it, and they tended to do relatively okay. A's, B's, C's, as you'd expect, sort of a bell-ish curve. But then there's a whole bunch of F's over there on the side, which maybe that's a little atypical. So we can also then slice by population. So now I know how all the students did in this class. If I taught this course, I already know this. I input the letter grades or I graded that work myself. But when it gets really interesting is, let's say we rerun the report after choosing to slice by low income. Now we can see that low income is the green, non-low income is the blue. So those green bars are shifted a little bit, right? So students tended to earn a B or an F if they were low income versus, an A, B, C, or F. So students didn't do quite as well if they were low income. Again, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but this does help to find patterns in the data. To make that even more evident for advisors, they get a detailed table below, which they can share with instructors after anonymizing data as needed. But this breaks down all the sections of that History 1 course that I pulled up. And again, this isn't actually History 1, but we can see here there were 7 sections. They ranged in size from 60 students at the smallest to 200 students at the highest. The average grade ranged from a 1.9, which is just below a C, to a 2.5, which is somewhere between a C and a B. But let's take a look at 2 sections in particular, Section 2 and Section 6. So Section 2, low-income students earned an average of a 2.3, C+. Non-low-income students earned on average a 2.4, just above a C+. That's a really small gap. That's a 0.1 GPA gap right there. But if we look down at the next highlighted one, course Section 6, non-low-income students earned a 2.6, so closer to a B- average, but their low-income peers earned just below a C on average, a 1.9, so that's a 0.7 GPA gap. So that leads, of course, to the question, why did students in that 6th section perform relatively better than in Section 2? So the other thing I want to point out is that in Section 6, there's a large gap, but their course GPA was a 2.5. The one with the small gap had a lower course GPA of a 2.3. So smaller gap, but lower overall GPA. Larger gap, higher overall GPA. So why was that average grade earned in 2 lower than 6? What were the differences in these classes? How prepared were the students? All the things I mentioned before about letter grades. What majors were in the class? What day of the week was it? How was the class taught? What was the modality of teaching? Essentially, what story is this data trying to tell? Having all this data is really powerful, and it leads to discoveries such as this. Some of the use cases that we've heard so far from people are, let's just use this as an exemplar for that. What did that instructor in number 2, did they do anything in particular that helped to make that achievement gap even smaller than you would maybe normally expect? It's closer to like 0.2 to 0.4 in all those other sections. And what happened in that Section 6? Why was there such a large gap there? Was it something about the teaching practices or the modality? Was it the students, et cetera? All this stuff that I mentioned before. But there's definitely a story to be told there, and this data exposes that for the very first time. There would have been essentially no way to look this up unless somebody was very motivated and went to file a request with the registrar, pull down grades, and had a research project and all that kind of stuff. But now they can go in and access this data immediately and start answering those questions. So again, the use cases I talked about a bit, but it's identifying performance gaps and figuring out how to close them. It's one of our big areas of focus. Identifying areas that don't have performance gaps and figuring out ways to duplicate that potential success. So maybe that one instructor with a very small gap was doing something incredibly well that helped all their students out, especially their low-income students. That's something that could be replicated potentially in other classes and raise those students' performance over time. You could also use it for yourself. If I was teaching a class, I could check on my distributions over time and see if there was anything that was happening. Are my grades typically consistent? If I filter down to first generation, is it typically consistent there, or is there something weird that might be happening? But again, just like with the previous one, this doesn't answer the questions. This provides the data that is useful for discovering new questions to ask and being able to make data-driven decisions. Last tool I want to show is EEE plus ScoreShare. This is different from the other two. The other two are canned reports. This is an actual web application that's available to our advisors. It provides individualized Canvas assignment score data, and it is used to monitor engagement and performance in courses. So this is what ScoreShare looks like. So over here on the right, you can see a screenshot of the tool. It displays the same data that is available in Canvas itself. It's powered by Canvas data, which means if you've ever used Canvas data, you'll know that it has a 24 to 48 hour delay, which can be a little challenging, but given the benefits of the tool, we figured it was worth that delay. There is a new product that Instructure is working on called Canvas Data 2, creatively named, it promises a 4-hour delay instead. So we're really hopeful for that. But what's really interesting about this tool is this is telling us a story about the student over here on the right. So in session 1 participation, they earned a 98 out of 100, pretty good score. It's well above the mean and the median. We'll ignore the standard deviation. This is test data, so it looks really weird. But then we look at session 2 participation, where they earned a 0 out of 100. So they're actually assigned a score of a 0. The mean was a little bit lower, 87, the median was 88. Again, we'll ignore standard deviation. But at some point between session 1 and session 2 participation, the student was no longer engaged. A 0 typically means that there was no attempt on their part. Usually attempts will get some sort of a grade attached to them. So this is really an opportunity for the advisor to look at this and say, oh, something happened here. I'm going to reach out to Peter, who's our fake student, it's our mascot. I'm going to reach out to Peter here and see what happened. Is there some way we can get him back on track? Did something come up in real life? What do we need to do to help Peter out? The same thing happens a little bit down below. You can see Peter was doing pretty well in this class. Midterm 1, they earned a 98 out of 100, above the mean and the median, which were pretty high in this case, but still well above those. The rest of it hasn't been graded yet, or hasn't been submitted yet, because this is a snapshot partway through our fictitious term here. But again, this provides us with an immediate ability to act on data and then go and intervene with a student and hopefully get them back on track and retain them and ensure that they graduate in a timely manner. To help with all that, we also provide additional information. So we provide a link to the course demographics report, so an advisor can click on that and then go run one of our COMPASS reports and check out the makeup of that class, see who's in it. They can also look up the course description and UCI catalog. We're hoping in the future to include links to the Canvas course space if they have access to it, as well as the course syllabus, so that they can kind of see what goes into the grading of that class. To help with that last question, we do show the category if the instructor is using weighted categories, and we show what the weight of that category is. So for this one, participation is 10%, midterms are 25, and so on. And we maintain this data so they can continue to access it for up to a year afterwards. So it's fall 2020 today, they can go all the way back to fall 2019. And we actually store the data even older than that if there's a need to pull that out in the future. So our use cases here, I kind of mentioned them. The second one is monitoring at-risk students, such as students on probation. Advisors can actually create a list of students and say, these are my 25 students on probation. I want to monitor them. I'm going to check on them every week. They can log into the system, click on the student, and then check on their progress in their classes. The view I showed you before, you can keep scrolling down and actually show you all their classes on one page. So they don't have to click and go back and forth. They can just have one snapshot. The other reason for ScoreShare's existence was actually requested by our athletics department. They have their NCAA compliance requirements. So this tool is helpful for them to be able to proactively monitor performance. So they can go in and check on the progress of all of their student athletes, make sure that they're still engaging in classes as well as engaging in their sports programs. Our esports program uses it for somewhat similar reasons as well. So whereas the other two tools that I showed were useful for finding data and then asking questions about that data, this tool in particular is useful for helping to keep students on track. There's a direct intervention opportunity in using this tool to help with student success. I just want to share a couple parting thoughts before we share our contact info. Just a couple last things to consider. The two topics that I dug into, the second one a little bit, the letter grade, what does it actually represent? The other one that I kind of want to leave as an open question is, we see all this data, we have the ability to slice by demographics and kind of see how various students of different, with different characteristics perform. How do we avoid implicit bias when looking at this data? How do we avoid bias confirmation when utilizing this data? This is something that we want to make sure folks are aware of, especially when using this sort of data or looking into using this sort of data in the future. Our campus here at UCI, we do offer implicit bias training as an online module for our users that they can go through. So 6 or 7 module training, it's really, really useful training, and we encourage folks to participate in that. And then letter grades I discussed a second ago, it's also earlier in this presentation. So with that, I'll leave you with our contact information. If you have questions about COMPASS in general, you can send them to compass@uci.edu. If you have questions that you feel are more appropriately targeted at myself or Briandy, our email addresses are up there as well. If you have questions about ScoreShare and Canvas data, feel free to send them my way. I'm happy to help. Our email addresses are compass@uci.edu for the COMPASS initiative. My email addresses are vadnais@uci.edu, and Briandy's is bwalden@uci.edu. And with that, thank you very much for taking the time to sit through our presentation and make it all the way to the contact information. And we look forward to chatting with you if you choose to reach out to us.